One of the most entertaining and interesting components of doing what we do here is when we observe politicians and pundits bobble their ugly heads saying words like sleeper cell and insurgency and create spooky metaphors to talk about their fears rising out of the grave. And the reason why it's funny and why it's entertaining is because we see them use words like a child that they don't really understand. It's like hearing somebody who took their first semester or their first half semester class in philosophy start waxing poetically about metaphysics and ethics and epistemology and trying to talk about Immanuel Kant's concepts of blah 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 blah, right? You took one semester or one class in philosophy doesn't make you an expert in Nietzsche or what he wrote about. But the reason why I say this and the reason why I bring this up is because there are terms being used frequently today, particularly sleeper cell, insurgency, insurrection, guerrilla, recce, and one that is tragically missing from the normal lexicon of both gun culture and society as a whole. And so we're going to talk about these things. We're going to talk about sleeper cells and domestic terrorists. We're going to talk about insurgencies and guerrillas, and then we're going to talk about recce versus patrolling. So you're going to get something political, just kidding. You're going to get something practical, and we're going to get something a little bit more specific on how we think about these terms. Because the calls, like as we hear people in Congress, particularly voice their concerns about there being insurgents entering America through our porous southern border and setting up sleeper cell agents in the United States to conduct domestic terrorism on behalf of international organizations. On the one hand, it's true, but on the other hand, there's something tragically missing from that warning. So maybe you could say they're right in the idea, they're technically correct, but not actually correct. Or, nah, that sounds a little bit too much like the well, actually meme. So let's get into the details. But before we do so, if you want to join us, you want to support the channel, you can head over to redactedllc.com. We've got a store there with some IR marking patches left and a few items. Our actual stock is starting to get pretty slim, and we are waiting on the Moon's Haunted shirts to be printed, but that's just business. So getting on to the details. Let's bring up 6 terms that we have to cover quickly today, and they are insurgency, guerrilla, sleeper cell. Oh, it's not even, did I miss a term? Insurgency, guerrilla, it's actually 5 terms, but whatever. Insurgency, guerrilla, sleeper cell, and then recce and patrolling as 5 different components that all have to be packed into this topic really quickly. So there is so the idea, let's start from what's most politically and culturally relevant right now, and that is going to be a sleeper cell. The idea of a sleeper cell is an embedded individual or group of people in an environment that we are in opposition to, that is going to be able to be activated and then, if compromised, not compromise the whole. So a sleeper cell is most often depicted in like movies and pop culture as somebody who doesn't even know that they're an agent. They haven't been MK Ultra'd into activity yet, but that's just not quite the right answer. So a sleeper cell, or the American version perhaps of a form of like a sleeper cell, might be a something to do with regime change, or it might be something more conventional, even if that sounds like a contradiction, like special forces. And what special forces do is they go into foreign countries, they train local insurgents and guerrillas to be capable of fighting against different forces within their environment, whether it's a government or a tyranny or a whatever, right? Whether it's this group of people who need to be trained in a clandestine fashion against that group of people. That's usually where you get the Green Berets to get you jump in, because they'll go into a country and they'll help out and they will advise and assist, as the phrase goes. They'll advise and assist local partner forces, training them to become capable fighters. In an example of this that happened in Afghanistan would have been when Green Berets attached themselves to what would have been the ANA, or the Afghan National Army, and they worked with groups of Afghans to help teach them how to shoot, how to move, how to communicate, and how to conduct things like night raids, day raids, call outs, movement to contact, break contact, the ideas of the battle drills. And no, if you want to read more about battle drills, look up your Ranger handbook. So go grab one of those, because the battle drills 1 alpha, 2, and 6, and so on and so forth, are just sort of phrases that we like to use. It's a little bit more of colloquial language. It's how do you do an introduction to CQB, or how do you react to an ambush. But so a sleeper cell is a bit of a difficult term, because it's mostly shrouded in mystery, and it's mostly conducted in sort of a pop culture sense. What would be a more useful term in our day and age would actually be an insurgent. Now, an insurgent is something very different than a guerrilla. They might have a similar scale, they might have a similar goal, they might be lumped together at times, but that is actually part of what an insurgent is trying to do. One of the goals of insurgency, as written from, or one of the goals that insurgency is trying to produce, is foment this idea of rebellion, of revolution. And so an insurgent might not necessarily look so much like a combatant. They might not function in a classically military sense, but what they'll be doing, what an insurgent is doing, is an insurgent is working within, living within a culture or a community, trying to uproot the balance of power in that environment, or trying to uproot the population's trust in their government, or trying to create a scenario, trying to mold the cultural scenario in such a way where the local populace is in opposition to even their own government, police force, or um, kind of cultural norms. It gets a little bit murky when you get really heavy into the culture side, but what's easy to, and helpful to define it, is to look at how individuals and organizations will function within a community to gather and gather and grab hold of disenfranchised young men, and encourage them to engage in what we would call domestic terrorism, as a format of fighting the oppressor, or a freedom fighter, or something like that. And a really good example, and why I would recommend this book, is one, because I think you can get it on Amazon for like $3 right now, if you get the hardcover, which I do recommend. But it is Why Young Men by Jamil Jivani, and I have mentioned it a few times on the show. And Why Young Men is, this is the story of Jamil, and I think someday we got to have him on the show. Is sort of, it's connected to America, even though he's writing from a Canadian's perspective, and yet then he travels around a little bit more. And what he's done in this book is, in the early chapters, he's told a story and identified how organizations identified and gathered disenfranchised young men and pushed them into gang activity or domestic terrorism. So Why Young Men is a really good example, though, of helping us understand what insurgency looks like. I'll try to put a link below. Most likely it'll be an affiliate link, so if you pick one up there, you help me out. But Why Young Men, as by Jamil Jivani, does help us look at how that kind of insurgent structure functions. The difference between an insurgency and a guerrilla in aesthetics is, an insurgent is going to try to make himself be a legitimate part of a population. They want to integrate, maybe they're an activist, maybe they're a culture leader, maybe they're a religious leader of some sort, but their goal is not only to spread their message, but also to foment a spirit of revolution in the population. The goal of insurgency is typically something like revolution, revolving, cutting over, changing over the government as it plays, which is particularly why governments and cultures that function in a democratic mentality or a democratic system are particularly sensitive or vulnerable to insurgencies, because an insurgency can easily and quickly legitimize its position, even if its position is the antithesis of the cultural norms around them. Because we believe in the things like the First and Second Amendment, an insurgent is really easy. It's really easy for an insurgent to embed themselves in a quote unquote democratic society, and or at least it's much easier for them to do so in a sort of democratic or republic style government than it is in a pure totalitarian or authoritarian one. And this is the price that we pay for freedom. The cost of freedom is eternal vigilance. And so the difference between an insurgent and a guerrilla, if we were to draw it out in rote aesthetics or basic aesthetics, would be an insurgent is going to try to blend into the population who he is working within, whereas a guerrilla is something more like a raider. They are going to come down from the mountains in this classic sense. Guerrillas will come down from the mountains, strike a strategic target, and then disappear back into the mountains. They'll go in, hit their target, and leave. Their purpose is to harass, damage, destroy, demoralize even a larger or an opposing military. The value of guerrillas is that they are the way that guerrillas typically function is in an irregular manner. They're not here to stand in lines, and produce sort of formal armies. The purpose of a guerrilla is to be able to come out of nowhere, strike, and disappear back into nowhere. Now, why would we make a distinction between guerrillas and insurgents? It's an important one, and it's an important one to start because a guerrilla is still a formal fighter. Although they are not a regular military, they may not have exactly a uniform, they may not function in that capacity of having the infrastructure of a regular military with its legitimization by a country. A guerrilla, the primary operation of a guerrilla is the use of force as a harassing method. The primary operation of an insurgent is to foment a spirit of rebellion and revolution in a population. Now, guerrillas can work hand in hand with insurgents, and they often do, where insurgents are the mouthpiece and the activist for an idea, whereas the guerrillas are the force and the inspiration. So a guerrilla will go strike a police station, showing the population that they're the organization which is supposed to keep them safe is incapable of doing so. A guerrilla will attack a police station, disabling a local police force, but an insurgent will create a scenario where it looks like that same police force's response to guerrilla activity is to punish the people. Or in today's example, a guerrilla might fly over your country's border with a paraglider to attack women and children or to attack a military institution, and then an insurgent will take the footage that they have captured of the counterattack and manipulate it to make it look like the power that was responding to a terror attack is actually the oppressor. This is it's a twofold strategy. Now, we brought up a book when we're talking about insurgency, and that is Why Young Men by Jamil Jivani. Again, here's it on for those who are watching on YouTube. Links below. And then the second one worth adding to your library, and these are books that I'm recommending to buy and put on a shelf. You don't have to read them right away, but they're useful to have. Buy them, put them on a shelf. The second one is War of the Flea by Robert Tabor. And the reason why I'm recommending this one is because it's sort of like the early text and idea of guerrilla warfare being presented in a Western market. Now, we've seen guerrilla warfare. We've even seen something that we're going to talk about in a little bit here throughout history. But this is one of those books that you want to have on your shelf, especially if you're going to read books like War by Sebastian Younger, On Killing by Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, Civilian Warriors by Eric Prince, or American Sniper by Chris Kyle. It fits within those categories, but it's a little bit more on the theory and philosophy and understanding of these organizations. If you want to defeat your enemy, it's best that you know not only their motive, but their modus operandi. So the next two words that we're going to address, though, refer or apply directly to gun culture, and that is recce and patrolling. Now, we've seen Grand Thumb put out a series of videos recently, or at least over the last year, on how to be dangerous in the mountains. And the word recce, if you want to kind of dig into the gun culture sphere, is it's not cringy. That's not the way of saying it. But the word recce, it has been sort of transitioned, if that's the right way of transitioned into meaning something that it doesn't originally imply. It's okay. It's not a condemnation. But it's helping us look at how the colloquial use of a certain term might be a slight twist from what its actual application is, and then how do we turn that into useful conversation going forward. So, history lesson in the short term. For the last decade and a half, maybe for the last decade, the idea of, well, maybe wouldn't be exactly the last decade, but from about 07 to 2017, the idea of CQB was the tactical Gnosticism of gun culture. What I mean by Gnosticism is this kind of mystical, magical, special skill set that someone could have. Think about it as, in the worst examples, gun culture approached CQB like self-defense martial artists approached Steven Seagal's Aikido. It was like, oh, that guy's a CQB master, and this is kind of an egregious example of it. But eventually, CQB stopped being the cool kid, the cool subject on the block, and we started looking at more rural activities. And this would again be How to Fight in the Mountains by Grand Thumb, and seeing things like Pacific Northwest Guerrilla go out into the woods, into these different communities and groups, trying to get out of rural environments and look at different types of civilian preparedness. And this activity that was referred to as recce actually looks quite similar to what we're calling guerrilla warfare, because guerrilla warfare is being able to is a irregular and informal format of war. It is less marching formations and movements, or marching formations and maneuvers like we'd expect in Napoleonic style warfare, or even what was publicized about World War II. And it looks a lot more like ambushes, destroying supply lines, and addressing and assassinating, not even assassinating, but attacking key leadership within an opposing force. Guerrilla warfare is what we're talking about here when we're talking about this idea of recce. But we also have a formal term for it, and it's something that we can engage in, and that would be long-range patrolling, or the classic term of ranging. And the subject of recce needs to be, let's see, matured within gun culture. When we talk about recce, we're typically talking about patrolling. When we're talking about patrolling, we're talking about one or two groups of people maneuvering through a rural or mountainous environment or a desert environment. Just let's stick with rural environment, trying to reconnoiter where an opposing force is, set up a counterattack or an ambush, and then destroy that target. The idea of ranging, historically speaking, is the word that we're looking for. Ranging is the method of using irregulars, non-standard soldiers, irregulars, and this comes from a very 17 into 1800s idea of the regular. It's this idea of using non-regulars who are familiar with the land to travel through an environment without leaving so much of a trace, and who are capable of functioning, at least to some extent, independent of heavily defended supply lines, And those people can go out and independently identify targets that of value, set up attacks, and destroy them. So, why is this different than Recce? Recce is a skill set that is a part of patrolling, or Recce is a skill set, a single component to a larger whole, and that is ranging. Reconnaissance means it means gathering information on a location or area or a target. Reconnaissance is a direct action with that is attached to further intent, and that further intent is the greater system of patrolling. In other words, Recce without patrolling doesn't really have any value, because all you're doing is gathering information and not being able to sift out useful intel. And so why are we addressing this term? We're addressing this term because as we continue to talk about Recce and patrolling and ranging, there are also some useful books that are worth reading, and one of them I'm going through right now, and that is The First Way of War by Guerrilla, which I've talked about a bunch of times. I'm almost done with it. And there are a couple of other books that are worth reading into as we continue to distinguish between regular and irregular warfare, limited and unlimited means. So, what does that mean for us going forward, and how does that apply to a political structure when we're looking at politicians quivering in their boots over the idea of sleeper cells? Well, one, your sleeper cell does not look like what you think it does. A sleeper cell in the United States is much less likely going to be some nefarious foreigner who sneaks across the porous southern border and implants himself into a community while keeping a suicide vest under the stairwell or something. And then one day he's going to get a call from his brethren who have activated him to go do a domestic terrorism. This is something that we're afraid of, but it's much less likely, and it's the high cost threat with a low level of probability. The examples that we've seen of these kind of attacks on American soil were described by Nassim Taleb as black swan events. If any one person had identified or stopped the 9/11 attacks, it's very unlikely that their name would even be remembered in today's history books, because we would have thought of it as another day of business as usual for airport security. But instead, all factors occurred in such a way where the event was able to take place. And as a result, we got this huge black swan event where it changed our perspective on airlines and created the NSA. Not a big fan. So, what that means, though, and why we bring this up is because if we're looking for the idea of a sleeper cell as crafted by 9/11, we are going to be making a mistake. We are going to narrow our view so specifically to a type of terrorist or a type of action or individual that is not really what we should be looking for on a local level. Sure, there are organizations and communities and cultures that are going to be concerned about that. But the problem that we're looking for, and the problem with the way that our politicians are presenting this idea of like sleeper cell, domestic terrorists entering in through the southern border, is that it completely blows out and masks where the real threat lies. So we're going to return to Why Young Men by Jamil Jivani. The author of this book addresses how an organization in Canada would find disaffected young men and convince them to, or give them a sense of purpose through their organization, and that sense of purpose would culminate in forms of terrorism. That what we'd be looking for, what a sleeper cell looks like in the United States, is not some abstract, nefarious person who crosses the southern border, but it's somebody in your city who it's someone in your city who is an activist, who is something like the Summer of Love participant. During 2020, we saw people on the ground in Minneapolis who not only took advantage of the chaos, but were supported by the so-called protesters to engage in domestic terrorism in the United States. It's going to be, it's no fun claim to make, but it's kind of true. When it's not, how do you phrase this in a more specific way? What we observed in Minnesota in 2020 was the use of activist organizations to instill and inspire terrorism amongst the population. And what an insurgency is going to try to do is they're going to try to obfuscate the line between maybe a guerrilla and a passerby, a protester. One effective tool that insurgency uses is it tries to convince the audience that the persons who are participating in the protest are not in support of the terrorism. It is trying to convince people that the people who are in the streets can somehow be differentiated from the bad actors. And in some cases, this is true. And in some cases, this is a tactic. It is not something that we enjoy dealing with. It's not something that's easy and obvious, but it is the reality of the day that we live in. In fact, you can read books like They Want to Kill Americans by Nance, by, what was his name? Something Nance. Malcolm Nance. And you can see a so-called expert in insurgency and counterterrorism and terrorism basically fail to do the minimum in his position. The role of a counterinsurgent is to distinguish between the insurgent and the population. And Malcolm Nance, in his book They Want to Kill Americans, throws that entire premise out the window and puts all of the bathwater with the babies, or all of the babies in the bathwater. He says he makes his argument so clearly that he is not interested as a terrorism counterinsurgency expert to distinguish between the population and the insurgent, which is the basic failure in our day and age. And I made this prediction in 2020 that within a couple of years we are going to see the organization known as Black Lives Matter align itself with international terror organizations. And now in 2023, that prediction has come true. Making predictions on the internet doesn't really mean anything, but now I have the opportunity, I'm vindicated, and I get to explain myself. The same ideology that drove people to commit acts of terror is this through Hamas is the same ideology that is at the core of certain elements of the organization known as Black Lives Matter. And it would behoove, in military phrase, those people in these organizations who are seeking after some sort of social justice or whatever their terminology is today to identify, isolate, and excommunicate those people from their organization, because it means that their organization is going to come under scrutiny. The problem is some of those people for the organization formerly known as Black Lives Matter are at the top. They're openly, publicly, and actively in support of domestic terror organizations. They were in 2020, they are in 2023. And that is where you're going to find your sleeper cell. Now, this may sound like a political argument, and this may sound like somebody just ragging on the idea of the left or this Black Lives Matter peoples. But in reality, this is where their affiliations lie. When your ideology and your worldview is such that it divides the world into colonizers and decolonizers, oppressors and oppressed, vigilantes and freedom fighters versus the evil empire, you are setting yourself up. Your worldview is such that it aligns with this terror organization. It's not universal, it's not absolute, but what you see is the same premises in group A being matched by group B. The person who's willing to attach a suicide vest to a child and kick them into the street so that they go and find a group of, I don't know, IDF forces or whatever you want to call it, or is the same ideology that informs the terrorist or the sleeper cell in the United States. And they use semi-official means to try to establish legitimacy in a community, like hosting a protest outside of the Walker Art Center in Minnesota. And then that pseudo legitimacy is used to encourage and inspire insurgency actions within America. And those insurgency actions, when they reach a certain level of violence, are then looking a lot more similar to guerrilla warfare, or what people are talking about when they're referring to as sleeper cell agents. So, what are we saying in summary? If you're worried about some foreigner coming across the southern border into the United States to go commit a domestic terrorism and be called a sleeper cell, you're looking in the wrong place. You should be looking into your streets and into your communities and to your culture and to who it is that you have trying to radicalize disaffected young men into participating in acts of terror. This applies to the right as well as to the left, but in current times and in what we've been seeing in culture in the last 3 to 5 to 10 years, most of that concern is definitely on the left because of their attitudes and their philosophies and their ideologies and the openness to support organizations like Black Lives Matter, who are willing and open to support organizations or terror cells like Hamas. That being the case, be aware that irregular warfare is something that is likely to take place and continue taking place, because whenever there isn't, or it's not whenever, irregular warfare fills the void between regular warfare. It is not necessarily the calm, but it is the murmuring and the bubbling and the more common form of warfare that exists across the world. It is important for us as individuals to be able to distinguish between insurgency and guerrilla operations, where an insurgency's goal is to change or break the will of the people, whereas a guerrilla's goal is to use improvised and non-traditional forms of attack or avenues of approach to disable, cripple, and demoralize an opposing force. We have talked about recce and reconnaissance as a component of, but not the entirety of, what we're referring to as patrolling or ranging. And so if we're going to expand as a gun culture and understanding how that works, we're going to want to make sure we understand that recce, reconnaissance, is an action used to gather intel in order to make some other action more effective or determine whether or not we're going to do it. And that full picture as a whole, getting out of the cities, moving in rural environments, long-term movements, staying out in the woods, whether it's like camping with guns as a joke, is what we refer to as either ranging or long-range patrolling. These terms are going to come up regularly and more often in gun culture, but let's get on with our week. So if this has been helpful for you, you can head over to redactedllc.com and support the show over there, or you can join us in further conversation and supporting the show if you would like to see us continue on out in locals, which is going to be redactedculture.locals.com. That's where we're going to get your first look at gear questions. That's where you're going to get your first jump on for all the kind of things that YouTube probably wouldn't like us to talk about, but it's nothing so risque that will get you in jail. Maybe. No promises. That being the case, if you want to support us, we'd love it. We would love to see you join us, and stay tuned because we got some interviews coming out here pretty soon, and we will see you around the corner. That being the case, go forth and conquer.